Hello again. My name is Dr. Dan Biddle. I'm a president of Genesis Apologetics, and I'm really encouraged tonight to be able to share my testimony of why I converted to a biblical creationist. So it first started out when I just was growing through my career as a behavioral scientist. I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. I spent about 20 years testifying as an expert in state and federal court cases on statistics, research, and evidence. And just grew to really love evidence and how you can build a case and testifying and statistics and things like that. It really grew an appreciation of the level of vetting that's necessary between when you would take something from a theory or from a book or from academic knowledge and compress it all the way through into court testimony. So I grew a real appreciation for scientific evidence and research. As part of my educational journey, I went to Western Seminary, a graduate seminary for a time, and loved taking classes there on Genesis and theology. And I'll never forget one of my theology classes where the professor, a really seasoned professor, said, look, and he's speaking from a command position of knowing the Hebrew and the ancient texts that were written, that were used to write Genesis, and he said, whoever wrote the ancient text of Genesis was very, very clear that the days were real ordinary days, and the Genesis genealogies that go in the first 11 chapters are clearly true history. That was a perspective of the writer, and so you guys have to deal with that. That was the perspective offered by the professor. But then he said in the very next breath, but if you believe in science, the earth has to be millions of years old, and biology has to be millions of years old, and even billions of years old for the origins of everything. So you guys go figure that out. And he sent the class out and said, well, you're going to have to deal with these two different constructs, these two different ideas of a Genesis that teaches from a young earth history perspective and alleged scientific evidence that shows that Earth must be billions of years old. So I went through a period of cognitive dissonance where I was trying to struggle in my faith. How can these two things fit together? And then I learned later that they really can't. I went to a presentation that was actually done by our Vice President, Dave Bisbee, at a large church here in the area. And the title of the talk was Dinosaurs. And the theme of his talk was Dinosaurs lived recently and were named by Adam. And I went to this talk as a great skeptic and thought, this is going to be hilarious. I can't believe this guy actually believes this stuff. So I went there, and about 15 minutes into his talk, I thought, you know what? My gosh, he actually does have some points here about why is it that all these ancient cultures have legends and myths and cave drawings and paintings about these dragon-like creatures that look an awful lot like dinosaurs that could have survived after Noah's flood by being on the ark and being let off afterwards and survived for centuries and go to generate all these legends. And yeah, it's very interesting. Where do you get that evidence about dinosaurs having soft tissue? And it's not just some types of soft tissue, it's lots of different types of soft tissue that we still find in dinosaur bones today. So I thought, gosh, that's very interesting. If these dinosaurs are supposedly 65 million years old, how is it that soft tissue could be preserved? Then he went through the evidence of Noah's flood and looked at all the layers and the extent of the dinosaur record. And the talk was so moving to me, I took about 3 months of my then free time that I had and burned some vacation time, and I really went into this issue obsessively. I spent thousands of dollars on books and DVDs. I flew to Montana, I flew to Canada, I did firsthand dinosaur research, and about half the way through that process, I came to the incredible realization, oh my gosh, it's all true. Genesis 1-11 is a real historical narrative. Earth is just thousands of years old. Adam was present when dinosaurs were created. He took dominion over everything. He named everything just as Genesis talks about. And at that point, I had to really reshape my entire worldview. And that's what leads us to where we're at today, because when I went to back to school night after going through this metamorphosis experience of mine, this huge awakening, I went to back to school night at a local public school for my son and listened to the teacher in the world history class say, well, we're required as part of the state curriculum to cover this evolutionary topic. Don't worry, it's only about 2 weeks of the class curriculum. And then she starts going into the story about why they have to teach evolution. And she says, well, don't bother if you're Catholic or Jewish or Christian. and you don't believe in this evolutionary stuff. It's just a short section. And as she's saying these things, I'm looking at the bookshelf, and she has all kinds of books there on Darwinism and evolution teaching. And then I look up on the counter, and she's got 3 different bottles. She's got like a quart-sized bottle that goes all the way up to a gallon-sized bottle. And I remember my son telling me, yeah, she uses these bottles to talk about the cranial capacity of early man leading up to Homo sapiens like we have today. And having listened to her talk that night, and being a recently awakened creationist who concretely knew that the Genesis account was a real historical account, I actually got sick to my stomach and had to walk home. I was broken at the time, just like, God, break my heart for what breaks yours, because here I was reflecting on my son saying, yeah, Dad, all these students that are going to this class, the 6th grade class, they all have their heads down, pencils in hand, and they're just writing down whatever the teacher says. They're being formatted like a hard drive program. And they're being taught from an evolutionary standpoint, and the evidence that they were giving seemed to be quite compelling. And there was, of course, nothing against it, nothing from the creation side. So that really broke my heart, and, Lord, break my heart for what breaks yours. I took several months of prayer and thought about that, and then later the Lord, I would say, gave us a commissioning to start Genesis Apologetics Ministry. So let's talk about science first from a big standpoint. When you look at the scientific method, and I was rigorously trained in this by going through my PhD with behavioral science and scored really high in the comprehensive exams dealing with research. I love research. I love the scientific method. I've worked with the scientific method. I've done research that's been approved by the federal government on a number of different occasions in a number of different fields. I love this stuff, and I've really grown to appreciate there is a clear demarcation. There's a clear line that divides 2 types of science. There's historical science on one hand that requires tons of inference, and that's when you're talking about things in the distant past that we can't see, test, repeat, or observe. Then you have the real kind of science, the scientific method, which requires observational science. You have to make an observation, frame some interesting questions, formulate hypotheses, develop testable predictions, and then gather data to test the predictions, and then test them. And all of these things require observation. This is how we put people on the moon and develop new medicines and things like that. It has to require observational, testable, and repeatable science. But when you look at this scientific method from a very objective standpoint, you know that 3 of these 6 steps cannot be done because you can't see, observe, and test evolution. You can't go back 100 years, you can't go back 1,000, you can't go back millions of years, supposedly, to test or see or videotape any form of evolution. And in fact, if you take all of the historical narrative that we have in libraries today, which is between 4,000 and 5,000 years of accurately recorded history, no one's ever watched or observed evolution happening. All we see is animals generating and reproducing after their own kind, just like prescribed 10 different times in the Genesis account in the 1st chapter. So evolution is not observable, testable, and replicable, and I want students to make sure they understand this distinction between real science that you can take into a courtroom and testify about, which requires observation, testing, and repetition, and historical science where you can't do those things, and it has a great degree of abstraction and inference. So when I would testify as an expert in court cases using statistical evidence, the really savvy attorneys that would come against me and come against my case and my testimony, they wouldn't address the facts. They're not going to attack me on the facts. They're not even going to attack me on my scientific methods or statistical procedures that I used. The smart, savvy attorneys who want to slam against my case are going to go straight after my assumptions, because the questioning would be something like this: Dr. Biddle, isn't it true that if your assumptions are wrong about your analysis, then your interpretations about the facts are also wrong? Isn't that true? And I would have to say, yes, you got me there. So if they could stick a big enough lever and leverage under the assumptions and start deconstructing the assumptions of my analyses and the whole house that I had assembled of the evidence I was prepared to testify in court about would deconstruct and fall apart. So it's the same thing with origin science. When you want to talk about evolution, when you start going into the deep past and using historical science and historical inference, the amount of assumptions that people are making about what they're seeing with a fossil record or whatever, when you pull out a fossil out of the ground, it's not date stamped. There's some analyses that you can do, but all you know for sure about that fossil is that it died and it was buried in whatever matrix that it's buried in. So that's just something important to think about when we consider evidence. So observational science is what we do today. It's the real scientific method. It's how we put airplanes in the sky and make new medicines. And historical science requires a great deal of abstraction and inference. So when it comes to viewing the data, the evidence itself of the world, we really have two different opposing worldviews that are looking at the same data, the same evidence. One would be through a context or a lens of the Bible, looking through the Bible into the data and the evidence and interpreting it through that worldview, that lens. Or one that would take man's theories and the secular ideas of evolution and interpret the same data. And based upon those two different interpretation lenses, looking at the same set of facts, we're going to have two different belief systems and two different worldviews, and oftentimes, for many people, two different life destinies, both possibly, of course, in this life and in the next. So these are heavy stakes topics that we're dealing with. So one is a naturalistic worldview, and the other requires a supernaturalistic worldview. So this is a fun meme that's been going around the internet, and generally it's true. True science is observational, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable, and millions of years of evolution is none of those. It's not observable, testable, repeatable, or falsifiable, so we encourage people to know the difference. So what about ancient writings? I mean, don't we have ancient history that goes deep, deep far into the past? Well, actually we don't. If you start talking to the leading experts on writing and the clay tablets and everything that are in all these museums around the world, yes, we do have writing that we can gather from the ancient Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians have some records. We have a really old Egyptian medical record that goes back before Christ, the Sumerian writings, and the Hebrew, and the Chinese probably actually go back some of the furthest writing. But after you start fizzling out between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago without using carbon dating, when you just have real, concrete, physical writing that you can put in front of you, and oftentimes what these historians will do is try to take these writings and correlate it with observable events, where a person's writing something down and saying, yeah, I'm seeing this big volcano blow up over here. They can tie those two events together and then correlate and concretely date that writing. There are other writing that people say is older than 4,000 to 5,000 years, but almost all the time they're requiring carbon-14 dating to try to date how old those writings are, and there's a lot of assumptions that go along with that. So when it goes for our ancient history, that going back beyond 5,000 years, what are we going to fill up this vacancy with? How are we going to start inferring about what to believe about the ancient past? Because the Bible only has about 6,000 years of history that goes straight back to Adam. And if you follow the Septuagint text, maybe 7,800 years, but you're certainly not going to get tens of thousands or millions of years. We have to have a choice of how we're going to go back into ancient history. We can believe in the radiometric dating that will get us supposedly back millions of years, or we can hop on God's train that only has thousands of years. But one thing I want to point out as a scientist is there's this thing that we use in science called the standard error of prediction. And a standard error of prediction is a confidence level around a prediction that we can make statistically. And did you know that the further we go back in history, the wider our standard error prediction gets? We know exactly what's going on today. We have records and video files and audio files. We know what's going on with politics. We know what's going on with world events. And you can go back 100 years. We have some pretty strong confidence too. But what happens if you go back 1,000 years? Well, that confidence interval of what we're trying to learn about starts declining, and it starts declining pretty rapidly when you go back 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years. We know for sure things about the Vikings and the birth of Christ and ancient Egypt and ancient China, but the further we go back, the less our confidence gets. So we have to fill up that shadow area, that gray area that goes into obliqueness, with a confidence that comes from faith or a confidence that comes from man's ideas that are largely going to be based at that point on radiometric dating. So it requires faith, and the assumption levels are going to go up, up, and up. So what are we going to do to trust in that empty void when all of ancient writing runs out? But wait a second, what about this radiometric dating thing? Don't we have clear scientific evidence that says that, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and then life on Earth started about 3 billion years and kept going from there? Well, one of the reasons that I don't ascribe to radiometric dating as a scientist is, as a scientist, we have to do this thing called validation, and it's what I did for 20 years in state and federal court cases. Over 100 court cases I would go in as an expert in validation. And validation is real simple. It's when you take your theory or your idea or your data and you try to confirm it in some concrete way to say, Your Honor, look at that. We've got this theory or the statistical process that says something might have happened, and then it happened in real life. So in job performance and test scores, we can say, well, people score really high on test scores. We should have job performance at a certain level. That's what validation would do. Validation when it comes to radiometric dating is real simple. If we take a rock of a known age where people watch a igneous rock get formed out of a volcanic eruption, we should be able to take that rock, if it's 50 years old or 500 years old, where people in history watch that rock get formed, we should be able to take that rock into a scientific laboratory and date it, and the calculated date should match the observed date. Makes sense, right? It should be, if it's a 50-year-old rock, should come back with a 50-year-old radiometric dating analysis, or a 500-year-old rock, 500-year dating analysis, thousands of years, whatever it's going to be. But you know that they've been trying to do this for decades and it doesn't work? Every single time they take rocks of known ages into a scientific radiometric dating lab, the radiometric dating ages are exaggerated by millions and millions of years. In fact, I was in an online debate once with a geologist that loved radiometric dating, and he said, Dr. Biddle, don't you know radiometric dating is a firmly ground principle of science? We know radiometric dating works. And he says, I've got 5,000 geology books in my library. And I said, look, that's great. If you've got 5,000 geology books in your library, can you just go find one? Just go find a single book that has a catalog of several different radiometric dating analyses where the radiometric dating age matches the known observed age. And he said, no, it's all based on theory. They don't have that type of validation. So when you're thinking about radiometric dating, if samples of known ages in the radiometric dating doesn't work, why would we assume that samples of an unknown age would work? It's a logical contradiction. If radiometric dating is true, we should be able to go to volcanic eruptions all over the world from many different centuries apart and collect samples that would clearly line up with observed science, and that's not what happens. The radiometric dating age always comes back with an exaggerated age. It's millions and millions of years older than the known ages of the samples. And of course, when you look at several different types of geochronometers that do try to estimate the age of the Earth, I have a sample here of over 50 of them that are from Answers in Genesis. There are dozens and dozens of geochronometers that do come back with thousands of years old for the age of the Earth and not millions or billions. So when it comes to ancient past and when we start going beyond the reaches of ancient history, we really can take Genesis as a real history account and look at an Earth that's between 6,000 and 8,000 years old, or we can take millions or billions, but the only way that you can go there is by having faith in radiometric dating, or you can choose to have faith in God's Word. So let's talk about this for a minute. Well, aren't we really splitting hairs? Does it really even matter what we believe? And yes, it does, because there are some really important theological implications if we believe in millions of years. So if we take a literal interpretation of Genesis, where God created everything in 6 days and stepped back and called it perfect and said, behold, it is very good, then we have 6 days of creation. And then at some point afterwards, we have the fall. We have the time where Adam and Eve, in their free will, chose to go against God, disobeyed, and by that disobedience, they brought the curse of sin and death onto the earth. That's in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. And God cursed the earth and said, thorns and thistles it shall now produce for you. So we have death and thorns and thistles as a consequence of our sin. And so we have death and suffering are brought into the world by Adam and Eve's sin. It seems like a very, very clear logical flow. So now we can say, hey, death, cancer, disease, blood, suffering, all those things are our fault because our ancient grandparents, Adam and Eve, had a choice. They messed up, and death and suffering come as a result of that. That's the logical, theological flow from Genesis. But if you take a non-literal interpretation of Genesis, we have creation. And somehow, radiometric dating and how they date index fossils would have millions of years of death, disease, carnivorism, and suffering before Adam and Eve were even here to bring the curse of sin and death. So you just see the challenge here. So now we have death and suffering and thorns and thistles that are supposedly existent in the fossil record for millions of years before Adam and Eve were even here to bring the curse of sin and death. So then at some point under the evolutionary time frame or the theistic evolutionary time frame, we would then have Adam and Eve. Then at some point after that, we have the fall, which really would have no effect because death, sin, suffering, carnivorism was already here through that evolutionary worldview. And that would, of course, blame God for death, suffering, bloodshed, cancer, carnivorism. All those things that were here would be part of his initial design. They weren't. God made everything perfect. Adam and Eve named everything. They took dominion of everything. And it was after that that the fall came, and that's what brought death, suffering, bloodshed, and disease. The theistic evolutionary viewpoint has it all backwards. So man's word would say, look, time plus death is what led from this shrew-like creature millions of years ago that somehow supposedly survived the dinosaur extinction on to mammals and then early man led to Homo sapiens. So it would be through that process of time, death, suffering, and selection would go from mammals all the way to man. But God's word said that it was sin that brought death, and God did not use death to bring new biological life forms here on earth. So when the Bible says that God saw all that he had made and it was very good, and we have the Garden of Eden here, we can't have them sitting on millions of years of stratified death in the fossil record. It just does not line up with Scripture. We can't have death, pain, millions of years of disease and suffering present before Adam and Eve were even here to bring the fall. Okay, so we can't have millions of years of these things leading to man's existence, and then whereas the Bible says it's sin, that's what led to death. So here's some biblical reasons why I converted to the biblical creation position. If you look historically throughout the teaching of the church from inception, the Bible that we have today is roughly 3,500 years worth of recorded narratives. And if you look through the predominant teaching of the church fathers and what the historians said from the Bible going all the way through there, we have about 6,000 years of history, and we've got a clear biblical creation teaching account was a predominant Christian view until just recently we had things pop up like the gap theory or the day-age theory that was more recent, or the framework theory, or progressive creation. These are things that are relatively new in history. And I think the historical approach has got lots and lots of grounded foundation, because if you look at the 32 biblical chronologists that existed for hundreds of years back, the vast majority of them, or at least all of these 32 historians, place creation under a recent paradigm. There's really two camps. You can take the Masoretic camp, which is what our Bibles today are mostly based upon, and it has about 6,000 years of history. The Septuagint version goes a little bit back further. There's a very deep, complicated discussion about how we get there, but it has to do with just a handful of the dates of the Patriarch being changed from one set of manuscript traditions compared to the other set of manuscript traditions. But either way, we have creation that is less than 10,000 years old. The thing that really did it for me was the fourth commandment. I had to approach the fourth commandment of the 10 commandments in a very honest way. And I think if there's any one scripture that boxed me into wanting to believe that the 6 days were real ordinary days, it would be the fourth commandment. And so this fourth commandment says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So here we have God as a communicator making a very clear message over to the Israelites that he created everything in 6 days. So the question to think about is when you break this down and look at the 10 Commandments objectively, well, communication includes both a sender and a receiver. God wrote these 10 Commandments on stone with his own hand. And you look at the 10 Commandments holistically, are any of them metaphorical? Things like don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie, don't murder. No, they're all very, very concrete things that God wanted the Israelites to believe and do. And you think, how could God have been more clear about this? He said, "For in 6 days I created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them." So the question that I ask people when they say, look, it doesn't matter, you can interpret it different ways, I like to ask people two questions that think this is an insignificant thing or you want to stretch out the days into millions of years. The first part is, what did God want the Israelites to believe about Creation Week? What God wanted them to believe is he was obviously referring back to Genesis 1, where he created in 6 days as the omniscient narrator. He was talking about that, and he said, well, I created in 6 and rested in 1, and I want you guys to take that same pattern in a real way in your life and work for 6 and then rest on 1. So he was saying, look, what I did, I want you guys to replicate. And there's some pretty famous theologians through history, Martin Luther being one of them, that says, look, God could have created in a split second. He could have created in over a day, but he didn't. He chose to model creation over 6 full days that we would have a cycle and a rhythm to live by. So the second question is, does God want us to believe any differently? Do we want to look at God in our spirit and say, well, you know, I know that's what you wanted the Israelites to believe before science and before they had all this information about science in the world, but today I want to believe something differently. Probably not. I think it's best to humble ourselves under what God said and believe it today, just like the Israelites did back then. Then when you start looking hermeneutically into the Bible and look at things about Genesis 1, we think, well, my gosh, isn't it interesting that God himself boxes in each of the 6 days with 3 describing characteristics. There was evening, there was morning, there was a day, and there was a number. So he does this with each of the 6 creation days. He says there was day 1, day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and he says for all of these there was evening, there was morning. The 4th day, there was evening, there was morning, there was the 5th day on forward for all 6 days. So if you look at the 6 days where God created, he really boxes each one in with an evening, morning, a day, a number. Now, why would he do that? I think he's trying to be clear in Genesis 1, and then, of course, he goes through and was very, very clear in the 4th commandment on what he wanted us to believe about these 6 days being so real and so practical that he wants us to live our life cycle in this same type of creation cycle that he did at the beginning. So, and then when you look at the word day, which is yom in Hebrew, it's used about 2,300 times in the Old Testament. And why do people only question it in Genesis? Yes, there are several places in Scripture where day does not have to mean a real day. It can mean age or a period. But when you look at Genesis chapter 1 and how the word yom is used in context, it means an ordinary day, because anytime you take that word and use it with a number, or evening and morning together without day, or evening or morning together with day, or night with day, which in these things occur dozens of times through Scripture, it always means an ordinary day. So for me, at least, looking at these things and wanting to do my best to honor God with his word, I'm coming at it saying, hey, he wants me to believe it was 6 ordinary days. Well, what about the 6,000-year-old earth? Where do we get that from Scripture? It's very, very straightforward. Genesis chapter 5, 10, and 11 provide us with 87 different patriarchs, and 33 of whom were given their birth and death years. So we start from Adam and Eve. We go back with their kids and their kids. God's providing a historical narrative here for us that goes back thousands of years, and we have lots and lots of connected history that are in just those 3 chapters of Genesis. When you look at them more carefully and you narrow down into Genesis chapter 5, look at what God does here. He says, well, Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness, after his own image, named him Seth. And after he begot Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, so 930 total. He does that for all of the pre-flood patriarchs, and we can add those all up and get about 1,556 years. So you have about 1,656 years of biblical history before the flood hit. And then we have the genealogies in the history that go from the flood all the way to Abraham, all the way through Moses and David, and it goes all the way connecting to Jesus Christ himself. Now, as a scientist, I've studied this topic exhaustively, and oh my gosh, did I run into something incredible. Thanks to John Sanford, he's a geneticist, worked at Cornell, developed the gene gun. He did some extensive studies on why is it that you have these 10 pre-flood patriarchs who live an average of 912 years, and all of a sudden there's a shelf that their lifespans dramatically fall off and begin this exponential decline rapidly right after the flood. How in the world could you have these ancient biblical writers say, yeah, these guys that lived before the flood are living 700 to 900 years with an average of 912 years. All of a sudden you hit the flood and their lifespans start going down 600, 400, 300, 200. But they don't just fall off the shelf. There is a gradual, systematic decline that goes down in the lifespans that happen after the flood. And so we can see this statistically, and we can even validate it from the text itself that says here, Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob, one of these patriarchs, and Jacob said to Pharaoh, "Well, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are about 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimages." So Jacob saying, yeah, there were these guys that came before me that lived a lot longer than I did, and then Jacob died at age 147, far outliving the people of today. The short explanation as to why this is happening is that when you take the entire gene pool of humanity before the flood, about 4,500 years ago, and you bottleneck them down to Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, you take all of humanity in the genetic varieties and stick them down to a bottleneck of just 8 people. They're on the ark for 371 days, then they get off and start reproducing rapidly, and now all of a sudden we have a compression, a genetic bottleneck, whereby the genetic mutations that start accumulating from that slight degree of inbreeding starts decreasing our lifespans dramatically. In fact, when you look at it statistically and plot it out, you can throw what's called a power curve on this, or a power law regression. It's an exponential form of regression. We love looking at this stuff statistically. Do you know that if you were to plot out these lifespans, I believe there's about 20 data points here on this curve, you take the ancient biblical text, it's about 3,500 years old, that was compiled from text before it. Somehow, whoever wrote this stuff down nailed an R-square of 95%. So you really have 2 choices here. Either the ancient writers compiling these lifespans were writing real history that reflected a genetic bottleneck where mutations were increasing and people did in fact start living fewer and fewer years, or the only other option you have is some ancient writer, sheep herder, out there with his feather and cap and some kind of a parchment, was somehow inventing a logarithmic exponential decay curve that fits along a predicted line with 95% accuracy, with only one of those data points coming outside of its predicted range. That's impossible. In fact, when you run the ANOVA on this and look at the statistical analysis, the odds of this exponential decay curve coming up by chance are less than 1 chance in a quadrillion. Some phenomenon was happening whereby these lifespans exponentially decreases. They just didn't just fall off of a shelf. They're not made up. It was an exponential gradual curve where the regression analysis can track it and say there's something going on, and biologists know this as a biological decay curve. In fact, if you zoom in on some of these points and look at the prediction, the standard error prediction over 10 generations after the flood, we can say with great accuracy we should have someone living between 137 and 234 years old. And the model predicts it. All the data points are right within that value. There's only one outlier. You can see there about 400 and some years. It's a little bit above the predicted range. But if you follow through that going, we have 15 generations after Noah. Then the model predicts they should live between 100 and 172 years, and all the data points fit tightly within that. So I think it's really extremely unlikely that some ancient writer writing with a feather pen on animal parchment would be capable of developing this degree of mathematical certainty. So we can't have this guy developing these formulas and following a power law curve and an exponential decline curve where the regression, where 95% of the variable y is explained by the data points x. It's just impossible. Something's going on with these lifespans that statisticians today are baffled by, because when they're recorded, they go right down a ski slope and they level out. So something was definitely going on there. We also know that these are real historical people, because Jesus himself referred to these Old Testament characters like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah's flood and Adam and Lot and Abraham. All of these go back, and our Lord Jesus referred to these people as real, true historical figures. In fact, he threw back and referred to the Old Testament over at least 42 times that we can gather here, and every single time Jesus referred back to the Old Testament was within a literal historical context. When you look at the messianic genealogy of Jesus, Luke chapter 3 provides over 70 generations that we can track historically, going from Jesus all the way back to Adam. And there's a reason that this happens, is to show that history and the gospel and our salvation story is grounded in real history. It's not some mythical account. It doesn't require a lot of faith to go back there and plug in the gaps. We have real connected patriarchs over 70 generations that started Adam, go all the way through the pre-flood patriarchs, go all the way after the flood, all the way through Abraham and David. You can connect that patriarchal line all the way from Adam to Christ in over 70 generations. Amazing history that provided by Luke. What about Genesis in the New Testament? Well, if you look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's referenced by New Testament writers over 100 times. If it's not a real historical account, then we might as well throw out these New Testament writers as well, because over 100 times, the New Testament writers refer back to Genesis 1 to 11 as real, actual history. So next, let's look at some evidence-related reasons that I converted to a biblical creationist. I think one way to frame this is just to take a look at 2 Peter 3. This is an amazing passage written by Peter, and he says, near the close of his letter, he says, look, above all else, know this, that in the last days, scoffers are going to come, and they're going to scoff two things: creation out of nothing and a catastrophic flood. And that's exactly what we see today. It's hard to turn on the news today or open any high school or college age textbook that talks about science or origin that doesn't deny and really attack those two things. In fact, there's some textbooks coming out more recently that do outrightly make an attack against Christian and Judeo-Christian beliefs about origins. So here Peter, 2,000 years ago, writing says, remember this above everything, that scoffers are going to come in the last days, and they're going to scoff openly creation out of nothing and the flood. And that's exactly what we see today. In fact, I would say that from my perspective of those two things, looking at creation and the flood, they're quite obvious to me. By looking at the historical evidence, it's very, very obvious that there was a worldwide flood, and it's very obvious that God spoke everything out of nothing, but it's obfuscated. And the definition here of obfuscated is to render indistinct or dim, darken, clouded, obscured, and muddled. So anytime you go through a natural history museum today, you will see lots of evidence for creation and the flood, but it's obfuscated through a naturalistic worldview or lens. So we'll take a quick journey through some of the highlights of creation and the flood that I personally believe are quite obvious, but have been obfuscated. The first one is, let's start with this. Somehow, in the past, the middle of America was collapsed and filled with water sufficient to bury not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions upon millions of land and sea creatures were buried and sandwiched together in stratified layers in the middle of America, encompassing 3 partial countries, over 1 million square miles in 14 states. We're looking at a stretch of about 1,800 miles tall, all the way from the northern tip of Mexico, going all the way up to the southern tip of Canada. There is a dinosaur kill zone in the middle of America that's just unbelievable. It's about 1,000 miles wide. So how do you fill these 13 plus states with dinosaurs and fish and birds and oysters and marine life and land creatures and fill them all together? But it's not just that. How would you fill these 13 plus state region of America with dinosaurs and marine life and ash, mud, and sand? Because that's what they're buried in. And when you uncover most of the dinosaur fossils in this 13-state region, they're buried in those 3 different materials: ash, mud, and sand. So you have to have a perspective that's going to account for those 3 different materials making a composite. Well, the secular idea is that several different seaways over millions of years or tens of millions of years rose and fell and gradually slipped under North America over millions of years as the seafloor subducted. The biblical standpoint is that no, something more catastrophic happened to explain that massive dinosaur kill zone of 13 states, and that one we'll look at today. So secularists and creationists believe that there was a Pangea formation that was rapidly split apart, is our perspective, and of course a slowly perspective over millions of years is a secular idea. So what you just watched in that animation, the secularists and creationists are on the same page. Yeah, that happened, but creationists say it happened in about a year, and evolutionists say it happened over hundreds of millions of years. But we would agree that the continental configuration was once put together and was split apart. We believe it happened catastrophically, and we believe that when the seafloor subducted underneath the landmass, it's reflected by a huge, huge amount of volcanic ash. So as the seafloor subducts, we have the Independence Dyke Swarm there. That's about a 370-mile stretch of a volcanic system in Southern California that burst open, bringing all kinds of ash. And then we have lots of different mega volcanoes that happened both during and after the flood that waned in severity. The first one, Independence Dyke Swarm, was when the seafloor began its subduction, bursting out and covering about half of the United States in ash dramatically. And then during the latter stages of the flood and afterwards, we have other huge ash deposits being laid down. How did that happen? Well, the Bible says that on the same day, all of the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So on the same day, not some, but all of the fountains of the great deep were burst open. And if you look at a barometric map, which is a map with the ocean water removed, we have all kinds of underwater volcanoes. There's thousands of them. Most of these, many of these fall along what's called the oceanic rift system, which is a 40,000-mile network of a linear rift system that covers the entire globe about 1.7 times over. And it was these linear rifts, these linear splits that broke open, bursting forth. That's the fountains of the great deep, and that's what served as a catalyst for pushing the land continents apart. And I'm going to cover this in detail when we cover my talk on Noah's flood later. The other thing that got to me with respect to a more spontaneous creation is when you look at the dinosaur family tree, or you look at dinosaurs' ancestors and transitions, and you look into the secular literature about where did they come from and how did they transition from one kind to the next, you run into things like this from the Dinosaur Encyclopedia that says, well, we have the yellow lines, which is the real actual fossil data, and then we have the gray lines, which is all inference. And so they think one type of creature led to the other, led to the other, led to the other. But when you take away the guesswork, which is the gray lines, which is all inference, we're left with just fossil data evidence. And if you subtract the millions of years, we have a whole bunch of dinosaur kinds that were created on the 6th day of creation. In fact, Creationists believe that there was about 80 different kinds of animal or of dinosaur varieties that were probably put on board the ark and brought on and died off rapidly after that. But if you look here, it's very clear that the secularists don't have clear fossil data connecting the transitions. All they have is the created forms that show up and stay, with mostly stasis in the fossil record. Here is a sign actually from the Chicago Field Museum that even admits, it says, look, we've got over 200,000 of these types of dinosaurs and 78 Tyrannosaurus rexes and 287 recovered sauropods. And the number of ancestors and transitions leading to these different types of body plans is 0. They don't have the transitions going from one kind to the next. It's almost like someone just came here on Earth, showed up, and put out all these different animal kinds at the same time, which is exactly what the Bible would say. So you go through and there's no common ancestor, and they don't have the transitions between the kinds. In fact, this is even admitted by leading secular paleontologists. This is Dr. Weishampel. Says, from my reading of the fossil record of dinosaurs, no direct ancestors have been discovered for any dinosaur species. Alas, my list of dinosaurian ancestors is an empty one. Another one here from Dr. Viol. He's a leading pterosaur expert. He says, we know only little about the evolution of pterosaurs. The ancestors are not known. When the pterosaurs first appear in the geologic record, they were completely perfect. They were perfect pterosaurs. So when you look at pterosaurs, you would expect one kind to lead to another kind, lead to another kind. And you say, no, when they show up in the dirt and we uncover them, they're already pterosaurs. There's nothing before them, nothing after them. They're still just pterosaurs. Now, what about dinosaur soft tissue? Now there's over 50 different peer-reviewed scientific non-creationist journals that established that there's now over 16 different types of soft tissue that have been discovered in dinosaur bones. I'm going to cover some of those specifically. Here's a video snippet from the Is Genesis History movie showing Mark Armitage stretching out a piece of Triceratops horn. So one must ask, from a practical level, if this Triceratops horn is really millions of years old, how can you take it under a microscope and stretch it out like that? This material is fresh. It's still got this soft tissue inside of the horn material here. You can grab these forceps and some tweezers and stretch the material out. It certainly doesn't look like dinosaur material that's millions and millions of years old. In fact, if you take one of these 16 different organic materials that they're finding in dinosaurs' bones specifically, which is collagen, there's been over 5 different scientific studies that have tried to estimate the half-life and the maximum shelf life of collagen, because bones are an infused matrix of both collagen and the bone mineral. The hard stuff and the soft stuff is all infused together. And the collagen, which makes up the soft material that's going into the dinosaur bone, has a decay rate and a half-life that can be estimated by scientists today. And depending on which study you visit, some of them say, look, we think the theoretical maximum half-life of collagen is only 10,000 years. Another study says, well, maybe 30,000 years. Another study comes out at maybe 100,000 years. And the latest, most comprehensive study says, well, we think that dinosaur soft material, that the collagen we're finding in these dinosaur bones could go between maybe 300,000 years and 900,000 years max. But notice this, that of all 5 studies, they're all saying the maximum shelf life of dinosaur collagen in these bones can't be more than 1 million years old. So if each one of these blue lines represents 1 million years, collagen is only lasting 1 of the 65 lines. Scientists today are in a huge conundrum saying, yeah, if we analyze collagen and its decay rate, it can't last them more than 1 million years old, but how are we finding it in dinosaur bones? In fact, Dr. Schweitzer just came out with a study recently saying, you know what, we can now confirm at the molecular level that the collagen we're finding in dinosaur bones is organic to the creature. It's not contamination, it's not biofilm, it's real collagen that came from real dinosaurs. Okay, and we can even do some of our own studies. We can take Edmontosaurus bones that we're finding, subject them to scanning electron microscopes, and look at them and analyze the data, and they do all kinds of really sophisticated science, and it comes back as hydroxyapatite, real bone. When I was a kid, it was drilled into me through public school that dinosaur bones are just rocks. They're all permineralized. The bone material has just been replaced by minerals from the soil, but that's not the case. The dinosaur bones that we're finding today are still real, original dinosaur bones. In fact, the head of the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller, the leading dinosaur museum, the biggest one in the world, says, yeah, usually most of the original bone we find in dinosaurs is still present. It's a real dinosaur bone. It's not a rock that's been, it used to be a bone. It's a real bone still. Now, there are plenty of bones that we find that are heavily mineralized, but many of them are not. They're just original bone. So the question would be, how in the world do we get these 14, and more recent studies have shown you can add nerves and cartilage and a few other things. Now we're up to 16 different type of biological organic materials that should not be in dinosaur bones. Things like FEX, histones, proteins, red blood cells, red blood vessels. These materials are in dinosaur bones. They can't be millions of years old, but they do fit a flood paradigm. Yeah, it's miraculous in itself that they could last 4,400 years and still be intact because they were sandwiched quickly in mud, but they certainly can't be 65 million years old. Okay, so in summary, I believe in biblical creation because I believe honestly it's true. It sets my life under the authority of Scripture. There's a lot of scriptures in God's Word that talk about the rewards that come to people for honoring His Word and believing it. Certainly shapes my worldview and differentiates me from the world. Every time I go to movies or a natural history museum, I understand there's a clear difference between how the world is going to perceive things and how I'm going to perceive things. It helps me raise stable, grounded children. And the Bible says, look, blessed are those who hear the word of God and keep it. That's in Luke chapter 8, verse 28. And Luke also says, records Jesus saying, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his own glory and in his Father's and of the holy angels. And then the Bible also says that those by the wayside are the ones who hear, and the devil comes and takes away the word out of their hearts, lest they should believe and be saved. So my encouragement to everyone tonight is don't let that happen. Don't let the enemy come and take doubts and discouragement and disbelief that's going to take the powerful word of God out of your heart and out of your mind. So thank you very much for letting me share. Thanks.